Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching.
We will look in this video in a distinct question regarding the distribution of revenues from the frozen Russian assets. And more specifically, we will discuss the following 4 points. We will first of all describe various categories of frozen Russian assets and what kind of revenues those assets can and should generate. We will discuss their different legal status, which is relevant to understand the revenue generation point. And then we will conclude by explaining those mechanisms which are currently in place and which provide for partial distribution of those revenues for the benefit of Ukraine, and still a substantial part of those revenues remaining for the benefit of those operators which hold the assets. The reason why I decided to make this presentation was the recent announcement made this week when the European Commission mentioned that it received 1.4 billion of revenues from Russian immobilized assets and transferred them to support Ukraine. Russian immobilized assets are those assets which are blocked specifically within the territory of the European Union, but also within the broader scale as a result of comprehensive sanctions being imposed against Russia. And we often hear about these Russian immobilized or blocked assets. And what surprised me in the announcement was a very modest amount which was available for distribution to Ukraine compared with the aggregate amount only of the assets of Russian central bank, which are frozen within European Union, being in the region of 200 billion euros and globally 300 billion euros equivalent. So it was of interest for me to understand the reasons for this incommensurate amount of assets which are reportedly frozen and relatively modest income on those assets which was available for distribution to Ukraine, taking into account that this 1.4 billion euros of revenues are the revenues generated for 6 months of 2026. Let's first of all look at what type of assets we are talking about. Surprisingly, despite sanctions against Russia being in place for 4 years by now, including with respect to the Russian central bank, which was one of the first targets of European, US, and other major Western powers' sanctions programs, we know surprisingly very little about what categories of assets we're talking about. There is just one very brief statement mentioned on the website of the European institution saying that as a result of the EU comprehensive sanctions against Russia, 210 billion of Russian central bank assets are currently blocked in the European Union. It is not certain what are these assets. Logically speaking, this can be assets of two categories. This can be, first of all, sovereign bonds or other type of bonds, which the Russian central bank was investing Russian sovereign reserves. And as the bonds have the term of their maturity, and as the bonds pay periodically interest, called coupon, this can be cash. So it would be very interesting to know what is the exact distribution of these assets as of today and as of last year, for example. And we can indirectly deduce so by reviewing the balance sheet of Euroclear, where most of those bonds were held. And we can see a substantial increase of cash on the balance sheet of Euroclear attributable to Russian sovereign assets, which means that by now most of those bonds matured and are represented by cash held by Russian central bank on the accounts with Euroclear and by Euroclear on the accounts with its correspondent banks. As of now, the amount of this reported cash is approximately 195 billion euros, which, as we can see, is roughly the same amount which is reported by the European Commission as the aggregate amount of Russian blocked assets. So then we can see that the major part of the Russian blocked assets are, first of all, the assets of the Russian central bank, and second of all, these assets by now are largely represented by cash. Certainly, this cash is in various currencies, which logically speaking should correspond to the bonds in which the Russian central bank invested. So should it buy, for example, French sovereign bonds, this cash will be euros. In case of US treasuries, this case will be US dollars. In case of Japanese sovereign bonds, this will be Japanese yen, and so on. And the exact distribution of that cash is not certain, but the reports of the Russian central bank were that most of the assets were invested in the European sovereign assets, which means that the overall amount of that cash should be largely represented by euros, followed by US dollars, British pounds, and yen. Nevertheless, despite this group of assets being the main part of Russian frozen assets, that's not the only part. There are two other categories which have to be taken into account. One category, which is approximately $60 billion or 50 billion euros, so quite a substantial amount, represents the assets of so-called Russian oligarchs or person subject to personal sanctions in the European Union. We again don't know what the breakdown of those assets are, but it's more likely that these type of assets are not represented by cash or publicly traded securities, at least to a substantial amount, but more represents the real estate holding of these persons in their privately owned companies, this type of assets, which again certainly generate income, which again, in principle, should remain frozen within the territory of those national jurisdictions which impose blocking sanctions on those persons, including the European Union. And then the last category of assets, which is again quite substantial, is represented by the frozen assets of those persons who are not personally subject to the European sanctions, but who use the Russian sanctioned banks, which by now is largely the entire financial system of Russia, for the purpose of holding their securities. And so, as the sanctions operate in a way that if the bank is sanctioned, the assets of this bank and of all clients of this bank are frozen, the assets of this group of people is equally now frozen within the relevant jurisdictions. And this is again quite a substantial amount. The estimate of these amounts, which was made by Ideas for Russia and Social Foresight Group, which is probably the only comprehensive report trying to map out the categories of Russian assets frozen in various jurisdictions. So this third category of assets accounts for approximately $70 billion or roughly 58, 57 billion euros equivalent, which is again quite a substantial amount if you think about this. We often hear that the assets of Russian central bank are called immobilized assets, whereas the assets of Russian sanctioned persons will be called frozen or blocked assets. There is a technical legal distinction between these two categories. Russian central bank's assets were blocked not because of the blocking sanctions, but because of a prohibition in the sectoral sanctions of the European Union set out in Regulation 833, which prohibited the management of the reserves of the Russian Central Bank, which was interpreted by the relevant institutions at that time as prohibiting any type of transactions with those reserves. So technically speaking, within the territory of the European Union, the Russian Central Bank is not a blocked person, but is a person which reserves within the European Union cannot be managed. And that is a distinction with those individuals which fall into the second group, or the banking institutions which fall into the third group, which are blocked persons, and which means that their assets within the European Union are blocked, as well as the assets of those persons whom they control are blocked. This technical legal distinction is really a distinction with no difference. As a practical matter, at least for the purposes of our today's discussion, whether the assets are immobilized, frozen, or blocked, no operations are possible with those assets. And this principle is the same regardless of the exact legal classification of the assets we discuss. So what does it exactly mean that the asset is blocked or frozen or immobilized? Well, it's easy to understand this with respect to a physical asset, like, for example, a yacht. No operations are permitted. The yacht cannot be sold. The yacht cannot be used. The yacht cannot be leased. And any kind of operations with respect to the yacht, like maintenance operations, need to be specifically authorized by the relevant national competent authorities where the yacht is located. So the blocked asset status does not allow to, as a general matter, generate any kind of revenues from the operation of the yacht or of a physical asset. That's the core of the blocked sanction status. This principle, which is relatively easy to observe with respect to physical assets, becomes more complex when we talk about assets like bonds or more so cash. Let's think about bonds for a second, as we saw that at the time the sanctions were introduced against Russian Central Bank, most of its assets were bonds, and by now they're cash. And one can legitimately ask a question, how was that possible, given that, as we just discussed, the general status of a blocked asset is that no operations are permitted. And that's exactly what we saw here, the transformation of bonds into cash. And the reason for that is that there is an exemption which, in essence, allows the issuer of the bonds to continue payments on those bonds, even to the bondholder, which is a sanctioned person like the Russian Central Bank, on condition that the proceeds of these payments will be blocked. And it's quite easy to see the logic for this type of rule with respect to the bonds, which are publicly traded and are issued to a wide number of persons. Let's take up treasuries, for example, which are issued in literally billions of one issue. Total amount of treasuries are several tens of trillions. It's impossible for the US Treasury, when it makes a periodic payments on this type of widely had financial instruments, to decide which part of that payment shall be withheld because of various sanctions in place, or shall be made. So the US Treasury will make on the due date for coupon or redemption of the instrument the aggregate amount available to those banks, which subsequently distribute those payments through the financial systems to the ultimate bondholders. By doing so, a single payment made by the US Treasury through the financial system becomes available to thousands, if not millions, of ultimate investors in the US Treasuries. One of those investors being the Russian Central Bank. So it becomes obvious that, as a practical matter, it's not possible to block these type of distributions at the end of the issuer. And the only workable solution is to block them upon their receipt on the accounts of the actual investor, in our case, the Russian Central Bank, or blocked persons subject to EU sanctions. on their accounts with the EU financial institutions. And that's what happened here. The distributions on those bonds in which the Russian central bank invested continued. They were, through the financial system, received on the accounts of the Russian central bank with specifically Euroclear, which is a Belgian depository through which Russian central bank invested in those instruments. And then upon their receipt on the accounts of Euroclear, they were blocked and are currently held there. That's an important point in our discussion, because what we see here is that, at least with respect to bonds as an instrument, and we saw already that this represents by far the biggest part of the originally blocked assets held within the European Union and more globally, and by now basically more than 90% of the assets of the Russian central bank. There was a transformation of those assets from the bonds, which represented the relationship between the relevant issuer. In case of the Russian central bank, they invested largely in foreign sovereign bonds, so the relevant sovereign nation, the United States, France, Germany, which issued those bonds, and the Russian central bank. And the role of the financial system was to intermediate those payments between the issuer or the debtor and the creditor or the investor. Upon the receipt of cash, the issuer discharged its financial obligations. Let's assume we talk about the final redemption of the bonds. So we talk about the situation when the principal amount of the bond was repaid on its maturity. So upon making that payment, the issuer discharged its obligations to the investors, and the relationship between the issuer and the investors, in our case, the Russian central bank, has disappeared and is replaced legally by the relationship between those financial institutions which now hold cash on behalf of the Russian central bank. What's important to understand with respect to cash is that cash is just a contractual obligation between two parties. So in case of Russian central bank, it has a claim against Euroclear for the repayment of those amounts of cash which were received by Euroclear from the distribution of proceeds due to Russian central bank and were blocked by Euroclear. And it is only at this level, meaning the relationship between the Russian central bank and Euroclear, that these assets are frozen as of today. Conversely, Euroclear, having the obligation to the Russian central bank to repay this cash, equally holds the same amount of cash on its account, for example, with respect to euros, with the European Central Bank. And that's a contractual claim of Euroclear against the European Central Bank. And as of today, the legal treatment of that relationship is that because it's the relationship between two non-sanctioned institutions, in essence, Euroclear can do whatever it wants with the cash which it holds with central bank. It can keep the cash with the central bank and receive interest on the cash. It can invest this cash in any type of assets. And these sort of operations are unrestricted by the underlying sanctions. Another important factor to understand this issue is that starting from 2022, we experienced the increase of rates by the central banks in major Western jurisdictions. And that's a very important transformation, because previously, meaning in 2021 and for almost 10 years before, these rates were zero or even negative rates, which means that to the extent a financial institution places money with the central bank of the jurisdiction where such institution is resident, such institution will make no profits on those amounts, or when the rates are negative, will even have to pay for holding those amounts with the central banks, and by doing so, central banks encourage the institutions to provide those amounts freely available as credit in the national economies. The situation has changed with the start of 2022 due to inflation and the result increase in the rates by the central banks aimed at restricting the inflation. This was a major shift, and a shift of very substantial measure. For example, during a period from September 2023 to June 2024, so for almost a year, the rates of central bank of the European Union was as high as 4%. And here it's important to note that we talk about overnight interest rate. That means that you hold the money with the European Central Bank overnight. This means that this amount of money is always available for you. This means that the credit risk which you take is the sovereign credit risk of the European Central Bank. And this means that given this zero credit risk and zero liquidity risk, because you put this money overnight so you can withdraw them anytime you want, you still have 4% income during quite a substantial period of time. And even today, although the matters related to inflation come down to a substantial extent, the interest rate overnight for placing money with the European Central Bank is to 25%. So these were very substantial amounts. And as we now appreciate, given the status of the cash, which we've discussed, being that it's blocked at the bank-client relationship, but it's available for the bank at the bank, its own bank or central bank relationship. This created enormous windfall for the financial institutions which had those amounts of cash. We can make a very rough calculation. If the total assets of the Russian central bank blocked around that period of time was, let's say, 150 billion, let's assume that during the period from September 2023 up until June 2024, part of the bonds matured and part of the bonds did not mature, and the matured part was 150 billion, so three-quarters of the amount of the total amount of the assets of the Russian central bank. Then if we take 4% out of 150 billion, we end up with 6 billion euros of revenues, which Euroclear was able to generate just by placing those amounts with the European Central Bank, so taking no risk whatsoever with respect to the operation of those amounts. Certainly, the situation was believed to be unacceptable, given the overall situation with the economies and given that the taxpayers support Ukraine in other forms of financial support. It was unacceptable that the private institutions would take this kind of windfall from the sanctions. Sanctions have never been intended to make private institutions rich. The purpose of the sanctions was to, first of all, deter Russia, and second of all, to support Ukraine, including in its military efforts, as well as the subsequent civil reconstruction. And they have never been intended to operate in the way they indeed operated. It took that, although quite a while, to understand this point, and only in middle of 2024, so by that time the war has been ongoing for 2 years, the regulation was put in place, which at least in part aimed to rectify the situation and ensure that the windfall resulting from this type of situations of revenues would be in effect used to support Ukraine and not to create additional profits from the private institutions which held the cash. And we would now look specifically at how the mechanism was introduced and how it operates. So the first point to note is that certainly, and to state the obvious, as far as that's the EU regulation, that relates only to those assets which are frozen within the territory of the European Union or which are controlled by the European institutions, for example, like Euroclear. To the extent Euroclear makes revenues on US denominated assets of the Russian central bank, that would fall within the regulation. But certainly that does not cover those assets which are held by the institutions outside of the European Union, which in principle hold substantial frozen assets, although again, by now we have very little detailed information as to what those assets are, but roughly 1/3 of the assets of the Russian sanctioned persons is held outside of the European Union from the publicly available source of information. The second point to note is that the assets which are affected by the regulation, meaning the assets, the revenues generated by which are transferred to Ukraine, are only the assets of the Russian Central Bank and its affiliates. So those corporations which are directly controlled by the bank, for example, National Wealth Fund. The rule does not relate to other frozen Russian assets, including the sanctioned persons. And as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, those are substantial in number, whilst the assets of the Russian Central Bank represent approximately 2/3 of those assets. Nevertheless, 1/3 remains out of scope of the regulation, meaning that the revenues generated by those assets are not available to Ukraine. Third point to note is that the regulation relates only to the central securities depositories. In practical terms, within the European Union, this means Euroclear and Clearstream, which again is understandable given that those two institutions, and Euroclear in particular, hold the overwhelming majority of the Russian sanctioned assets. But nevertheless, a principal question remains why the remaining part, which is still not insignificant, is around 10 to 15 billion, and which presumably was held by the Russian Central Bank and bank deposits, is falling outside of the scope of this regulation. Important point is a timing point, which we've discussed. The regulation relates only to the profits made from February 2024, by which time the war was ongoing for 2 years. And as we saw, the period from 2023 to 2024 was actually the period of the highest rates and accordingly the highest profits generated by the assets. Final point to note is that there is no obligation to transfer the entire amount of the profits generated. The profits are analyzed in its accounting context, so meaning that the institutions are capable to reduce them by the losses, which in their judgment should be properly allocated to those profits. The institutions can allocate future losses, which they reasonably believe may be allocated by creating so-called provisions, and these are substantial in number. From 2025 accounts of Euroclear, we can see that almost 500 million of losses, which includes both direct losses and the provisions which they made in the accounts, is allocated to the profits which they generate by these revenues. So quite a substantial amount. So the losses reduce the profits, and then the profits are taxed into the jurisdictions where the institution is located, which, for example, in Euroclear in Belgium would be a 25% corporate tax. And this tax, again, is not available to Ukraine, but is used for national purposes. And only the remaining amount in principle is transferred to the European Commission for the further distribution to Ukraine. So all in all, these type of deductions and reductions seem to explain what was an apparent and manifest inconsistency between the amounts of frozen assets, which are commonly reported both in the press and in the formal statements of the European institutions, and relatively modest amounts which are eventually distributed as profits generated by those efforts to support Ukraine. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations. Thank you very much for watching.